On the 1st of August 2014, 3 people set out to sail across the English Channel. This was a journey that had been undertaken many times before, but for these 3 people, there was something that made this trip different. Something that would make their journey fraught with peril and potential for disaster. And this was one simple fact. Not one of them had any sailing qualifications or previous experience. This is their story. The expedition was led by Arten Waters, a mild-mannered C++ programmer by day, but by night he was a maverick, no-holds-barred, wild and crazy Java developer whose coding style had been likened to experimental jazz. Nobody could understand it, but they believed it to be damn good. It was highly unlikely that any of these skills would be any use to them on their trip. The first mate was Irina, a Ukrainian refugee on the run from the UK border force, hoping to find sanctuary on mainland Europe. She was also wanted for questioning by the fashion police. This trip would be her ticket to freedom. Finally, Hesketh McGonagall, a renowned doctor of psychology, was sent along to monitor the change in behavioural patterns of the crew as the stressful conditions took their toll. Arten had been reluctant to have him present on the trip, and he fought ferociously against it before succumbing to a bribe from the producers. First task was to find a vessel suitable for the voyage. They spent weeks scouring boatyards and rubbish tips trying to find something that would fit their meagre budget, before finding an old 1970s sloop called the Wild Rose. Arten had swapped it with the owner for an old Nokia phone he had come across in his attic. The boat was the nautical equivalent of a 1950s Chevy, something that had been cool in its day, but now the brakes were shot and it leaked oil all over the driveway. The gel coat, once a shiny white, had turned into a yellowish brown, giving it the look of a chain-smoking alcoholic. There were holes where once there had been instruments, probably taken and sold separately on eBay. Later on, it was established that Arten himself had sold some of these in order to raise funds for the voyage. He had been overheard saying that he couldn't see the need for a compass on a boat. The sail looked like it had been made from an old tarpaulin stitched together. The material was rough and it had stiffened over time. The days of dancing merrily in the breeze were long behind it. Instead of flaking neatly, it had to be crumpled and squashed before it would fit in a sailbag. The decision to go had been made hastily, as the UK border force were closing in on Irina. She had managed to escape from one of their ships as she was being deported. Arten had to learn the skills needed for this voyage at short notice. After 3 months preparing the boat, this was the one thing he had put off till the last minute. To make up for lost time, he spent hours painstakingly poring over the relevant textbooks. Some last-minute repairs had to be carried out on the tiny 4-horsepower outboard that would have so much responsibility thrust its way. Arton spent hours scrubbing the boat and making sure that the Wild Rose looked her best for the television crews he expected to cover their departure. He'd been in touch with BBC, ITV, Channel 4 and Sky News, who had all promised to cover the story. In the end, none of them showed up. A passage plan was quickly prepared. Arton assured the crew that by keeping the passage plan simple and brief, they would have less to adhere to and would therefore be safer. They set off at daybreak to avoid detection by the UK Border Force, who had a reputation for not being early risers. Dry ice was added for effect, at great expense to the production team. As they began their voyage, it became immediately clear that Dr. McGonagall would be a serious impediment for them, as he struggled with even the most basic of safety precautions. The calm seas put them all at ease. Arton assured the crew that this was bound to be the easiest crossing in human history. With these assurances, the crew began to relax. As they made their way out of the river estuary, Arton was shocked to discover that many of the road signs had been wrecked and some painted over by vandals. They soon discovered the fate of some of the other vessels that had attempted this journey before. Arton looked decidedly nervous as he began to realise this trip would be a little bit more involved than originally expected. Unsure of their way without any road signs, they asked an early morning sunbather for directions. He told him he was an eccentric millionaire giving away all his worldly possessions. He'd given almost all of them away, but still had some fruit left. The crew graciously accepted an orange from him. He said he was going to Ramsgate, where he planned to trade his yacht for a beach hut, where he intended to live, eating nothing but fish and chips for the rest of his life. Ramsgate was about halfway to their destination, so he could point them towards France from there. The crew gladly accepted and allowed him to accompany them. As the voyage progressed, Arton decided to show Hesketh who was in charge by constantly sending him on menial errands.
Yeah, they kept us bored.
Even though, like the rest of the crew, Dr. McGonagall had absolutely no sailing experience, Arton sensed that he was completely incompetent and possibly borderline insane, and he needed to keep him out of the way. For this reason, he asked McGonagall to keep a lookout for icebergs. The doctor took this role very seriously. At the same time, he continued to take notes about the crew's behaviour, unaware of the fact that they were watching him closely too. Their concerns grew when he appeared from the galley with yogurt smeared all over his face. Later on, he proclaimed himself to be gender fluid. He threw his sunglasses overboard and produced a pair of ladies' sunglasses. The crew decided to ignore these quirks, and what they were learning was an extremely eccentric man. They were about 10 miles into their journey, and then disaster struck. They discovered that they were too far offshore to pick up any internet on their phones. With the loss of the internet connection, the crew could no longer check their email or update their Facebook status. Arton had planned to use Google Maps to help them navigate their way, but this now looked like an unfeasible plan. This seemed to be an insurmountable challenge so early on in the expedition. An emergency meeting of the crew was held, and after much deliberation, they decided to continue with their journey, hoping to pick up free Wi-Fi from some of the passing ferries. Unfortunately for them, there was no ferry routes anywhere near the route they were taking, and they soon discovered that none of the cargo ships had free Wi-Fi. It was only an hour later when the real trouble hit. A scream from Irina at the front of the boat alerted them to the oncoming storm. The crew began to panic as the waves grew bigger and the winds gained strength. To seasoned sailors, this weather was merely some strong winds, easily dealt with by putting a reef in the mainsail, but to these inexperienced sailors on such an unseaworthy craft, it felt like a hurricane. Arton's initial reaction was to panic. He locked himself into his quarters, and it took the crew half an hour to coax him out. He reluctantly resumed his duties as skipper. As the winds strengthened, the waves grew higher and the tide turned against them. Their boat slowed to the speed of around 1 knot. Unfortunately, Arton was not aware that the tide had turned against him because he had skipped a section of the book on tides, telling his crew that it was only relevant if they were planning a trip to the seaside. Nor was he aware what a knot was, because he hadn't paid much attention to that part of the book either. As they bobbed along against those metre-high waves in the 20-mile-an-hour winds, visions of the movie The Perfect Storm were running through Arton's mind. Would they get out of this alive? They were much relieved when Ramsgate finally came into view, but the strong headwind and tide meant it would be hours before they'd reach it. Having tied up for the evening, they all knew that their voyage could go no further, and it was no surprise when Arton told them that the trip ended here. But he did have a plan for a second attempt.